Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Rocco, again, and thanks for coming back, guys, because today we're going to be talking about just an album that's very special to me, just one of those perfect albums, an absolute masterpiece that, man, I just get so excited about every time I listen to it and every time I think about it. Discipline by King Crimson, their 1981 comeback album, if you could even call it that. Uh, and this album here, guys, I don't really listen to it very often. It's one of those albums where you gotta be in the mood for it. It's not one of those like albums like a Black Sabbath album I could just throw on anytime, jam out to it, and or even something like a Genesis album that really I find has like the re-listenability factor. This album here is just one of those albums that when you're in the mood for it and you put it on, it's one of the greatest listening experiences ever, and really, in my opinion, one of the all-time best progressive rock albums. Now, I know what you're thinking. Rocco, hold on a second, like, King Crimson had so many better albums. In the Court of the Crimson King, Lark's Tongues and Aspic, Red, all those classic albums that came out before this. Why would you talk about Discipline as your first King Crimson review? Well, let me tell you guys. Number one, it's the album I've been listening to for the past few days, so it's fresh in my mind and I'm excited about it. And number two, I think it's just a really fascinating album, just in terms of how the band even came together. And the sound on this album is just extremely unique. No other band, no other album even sounded remotely like it. And that's just really the King Crimson way. I mean, these guys, or I should say Robert Fripp, was just a consummate innovator. Every single album he did had a different, unique sound to it, with some core King Crimson elements. Not going to deny there's some repeated motifs and elements throughout King Crimson's discography, but they were always diving into new things, always innovating, and really just defining what it means to be a progressive rock band. And that's obvious, considering that they were the first progressive rock band, and definitely one of the best. And the thing about King Crimson is that I really find that because of all the experimentation and all the risk taking they did, their discography, although fantastic, it's a little bit less consistent, a little bit more hit or miss, at least in my opinion, compared to those bands like Genesis and Yes, that had this kind of core classic discography that didn't really wander too far away from their core sound. King Crimson is nothing like that. And really what this band is Robert Fripp, the founder of the band, the lead guitar player. He's really the only consistent member, and every single album seems to have a different lineup. Now, there were a few periods in King Crimson's discography where there was some relative stability. The three awesome albums in the mid-70s, what I consider the heavy King Crimson, Lark's Tongues and Aspic, Red, and Starless and Bible Black. I know I got the order mixed up there. That period there was pretty stable, had a pretty unique lineup, and a pretty distinctive sound from the rest of Crimson. And same here with Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair. It was a pretty stable lineup, but more or less, King Crimson was just basically a collection of fantastic musicians and Robert Fripp, just kind of going out there, really wandering off and experimenting and creating some fantastic things. And again, I'm not a huge fan of some albums, but when King Crimson struck gold, let me tell you guys, they fucking struck, because some of like the best Crimson albums, and this one included, are some of the absolute pinnacles of the progressive rock genre. The debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, Red, Lark's Tongues and Aspic, and this album, Discipline, I really consider four of the best albums ever made by any band, and just really solidifies King Crimson's place as kind of the kings of progressive rock in the purest sense. They were always progressing, and Discipline is just a perfect example of that. I mean, they totally changed their sound on this album, and again, it's a new lineup. Bill Bruford's really the only member kind of from the past, and it's just such a drastic change. Where if you were to listen to this album and then In the Court of the Crimson King, which came out about 10, 11 years before this, you would just be totally amazed that it's the same fucking band. And I'm amazed to this day. I mean, sometimes I listen to kind of random King Crimson tracks, make like a playlist of all their different eras, and it just really puts it into perspective how original, how creative, and how eclectic this band was. Again, these guys were the definition of eclectic progressive rock. So, sorry, that's my little intro on King Crimson. I know I haven't reviewed an album by them yet, so I thought I'd give you guys my perspective on what I think of this band. And of course, Robert Fripp, their fearless leader, who's just fucking incredible. And really the glue that held this band together. As Robert Fripp always said, King Crimson was really a way of doing things. It wasn't a particular lineup. It was just a specific way, a specific approach to music that really comes through in their amazing discography. So, a band that wasn't accessible for me at first. When I first started getting into King Crimson, I think it was about, I was in high school. I think I was in grade 10 or 11. And I had heard In the Court of the Crimson King before. I mean, come on, who hasn't heard that track? And a few others, like Epitaph, which I found absolutely fantastic. But when I did my own research and I tried getting into them, I found that other than those two songs, I couldn't really get into King Crimson. I mean, I'd heard some other tracks on their debut album, didn't really do it for me. Schizoid Man was just too crazy for me at the time, and I know that's, insane to say now. It's one of the greatest songs ever. But then I move on to other stuff. Like, I tried out Lizard. That was a big turn off at that point. Lark's Tongues and Aspic was way too experimental for me. And even this album was just way too weird. So I tried to get into them because I was huge on progressive rock back then in high school. But for some reason, this band just wouldn't click with me. Then years later, I was actually on YouTube. And funny enough, I was watching Elephant Talk, which was a live version of Elephant Talk that they did on some British TV show or some American TV show. And it absolutely mesmerized me. It was just fantastic with Tony Levin's funky bass line. And I'm like, you know what? I got to get back into King Crimson. And I think this was about 2016, 2017. So a couple of years back. So again, pretty late to be getting into them for a hardcore progressive rock fan such as myself. But I kept trying. And for some reason, the music definitely clicked with me again. I went back to In the Court of the Crimson King. Just totally blew me away. And then I started working my way forward. The Lark's Tongues and Aspic, Red, Starless, and Bible Black era really spoke to me so much more than it did like 4 or 5 years back when I first started listening to Crimson. And as well as this album here, Discipline, just totally blew me away. And, I became a huge fan. I became totally obsessed. And what fucking kills me? What fucking kills me about this is that King Crimson came to Toronto in 2017, where I live. And this is when they came just before, like literally days before, I saw that Elephant Talk video. So maybe it was in my recommended because they were on tour and I don't know, who knows, or maybe it was just a coincidence. But the point is, I missed that concert, and the next time they came was in 2019. But you know what? I capitalized on that, guys, because I saw them in 2019 in September, and let me tell you guys, it was the best concert I ever saw in my life, or at least one of the best. If not the best, then like the top two. It was just absolutely incredible. And man, these guys, Robert Fripp, he's what, maybe like mid-70s at this point? They played a 3-hour show, and it was phenomenal. I couldn't believe the energy these guys were displaying, and all the different arrangements of the classic King Crimson tracks. It was just a night to remember. I'll never forget it. And one of the greatest musical experiences I ever had in my life. And it's just funny thinking back that it almost didn't happen because a distant family member, like my second or third cousin, was getting married that day. And, I didn't give a fuck. I opted out of going to that wedding, pissed off my whole family, and went to see King Crimson. And it is a decision that I will never regret because that concert was absolutely freaking phenomenal. And I was a little bit worried too because it was an outdoor stadium, Budweiser stage. And normally King Crimson, they play in Massey Hall, which is this really old-fashioned concert hall in Toronto with fantastic sound quality. So I was worried that stadium arena kind of setting for King Crimson wouldn't really work. It's an outdoor stadium as well, but it worked perfectly, and everyone was having a great time. And I think that King Crimson's strict no cell phone policy at their concerts really had a lot to do with that because, everyone was just felt so immersed into the music and just really enjoying it and having a great time. And let me tell you guys, I'm so happy they took a firm stance on the cell phones because nothing takes you out of the experience, nothing kills the vibe and the atmosphere of a concert than just seeing the entire front row of the stage watching the concert through a fucking cell phone lens. I mean, come on. It always fucking irritates me. So good for you, King Crimson. And it was awesome. There were a lot of old fans, a lot of young fans as well. A lot more young fans than I was expecting. But I guess that goes hand in hand with King Crimson's timeless, experimental nature. I mean, they really attract people from all walks of life. And it was just such a fantastic time. I love how, they, at this point in Crimson's career, they're not really focused on writing new material. They're just a fantastic band that wants to get out there and play all of their classic songs and reinterpret a lot of their classic songs. Like some of the tracks from this album, Discipline, that they played sounded totally different. And it actually took me like a good 1 to 2 minutes into the track to even realize that it was a song from Discipline, because they just totally revamped it. So again, these guys aren't a legacy act. They're going out there putting new spins on their classic tracks. And I also love how they played a lot from In the Court of the Crimson King. I feel like in past tours they kind of neglected that album. On this one here, they're playing Epitaph, Schizoid Man, which for me was the big highlight of the show, and just fucking phenomenal experience. So anyway, guys, that's kind of like my intro to the band. Now let's talk about the history behind Discipline. Alright guys, so although this album came out in 1981, the story of this album really begins in 1974 when Robert Fripp suddenly decided to disband the existing lineup of King Crimson, which was, again, I mentioned this was one of their more stable periods, and probably my favorite era of the band, producing the classic albums Larks, Tongues, and Aspic, Starless and Bible Black, and Red. Three of their heaviest, most sinister sounding albums with a lot of free-form experimentation, a lot of loose song structures, and improvisations, which were all freaking amazing. So it's a shame that that aspect of the band didn't continue. But as time went on with that lineup, Robert Fripp just started feeling disillusioned with the whole music industry and King Crimson in general. And he was kind of going through kind of like this existential crisis, really struggling with like his spiritual beliefs. He was dabbling in all kinds of different spiritual things at the time. And at one point, he even said his head was about to blow off at one point. So who knows what that means, but obviously Robert Fripp was struggling, and it really showed on their last album, Red. Not musically, but in terms of when they recorded that album, he was really withdrawn. He kind of just kept to himself in the studio. But it's amazing how that album ended up being so fucking amazing, by the way. But yeah, like that was kind of like the beginning of the end. Then by the end of that album, he suddenly announced that the band was going to disband. He just had no interest in King Crimson, no interest in music anymore. And it was kind of a weird time for him, kind of like this existential crisis. So he basically spent a year or two kind of finding himself. And then throughout the later half of the 70s, he did a lot of smaller projects, collaborated with a lot of the progressive rock legends of the past, like Peter Gabriel and David Bowie, playing a lot on his album Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. Not that David Bowie's progressive rock, but anyway, I think he is. But you know what I mean, a lot of those legendary musicians. I did some stuff with Brian Eno as well, made a solo album, and just started really developing his guitar craft at that point, really honing in on Frippatronics, which is kind of like this tape loop effect that he would employ, and really, just learning a lot of new tricks and enhancing his already stellar and sublime guitar playing. I mean, again, one of the most unique players of all time. No one plays like this guy. And, apparently he's even like tone deaf or something. So I think that might have something to do with it. He's very atonal in his playing, but to me, it sounds absolutely fantastic. And he's also one of the heaviest and most intense guitar players, too. That's something some people forget about. It's like, this guy was absolutely menacing on the guitar when he wanted to be. But again, he really had it all. And by the end of the 70s, he had just been on so many musical adventures since the end of King Crimson. And he was ready to kind of hone all the new things he learned on the guitar, all the new tricks up his sleeve in a band format. Again, he had done some solo projects, but he felt that, if he formed a new band, they would go on to do fantastic things. And he had all these ideas. He was just really excited at the turn of the 70s. So come 1981, he finally decided to get a new band together. So he calls up his old friend Bill Bruford, who we all know was the drummer during that Larks, Tongues, and Aspic period, and would go on to be one of Fripp's longtime collaborators, and just one of the greatest drummers of all time. I mean, who doesn't fucking love Bill Bruford? His work with Yes, and his solo career, which was also fantastic. A lot of people got to check that shit out. You just can't go wrong with this guy. He's just one of the greatest percussionists as well. And Robert Fripp knew that he was someone he could always depend on. So he called up Bill Bruford, and together they decided to form a new band. It wasn't going to be called King Crimson, that's the thing. It was going to be totally unique, a totally different listening experience to anything that came before it, keeping in tune with the whole King Crimson experimentation theme. And Robert Fripp had a vision. Earlier on the early 70s King Crimson albums, there was always kind of a foil to his guitar playing. On In the Court of the Crimson King, it was Ian MacDonald's incredible saxophone playing, as well as the next album, In the Wake of Poseidon. Then they got violin and percussion during the Larks, Tongues, and Aspic era, and he was always kind of adding in these extra instruments to kind of act as a foil to his classic guitar playing. Now, on this album here, I think Fripp kind of just ran out of instruments to choose from. So he just said, you know what, how about a different guitar player? Let's get a different guitar collaborator. And the thing about Fripp was he wanted a guitar player that sounded absolutely nothing like him, someone with a completely different style. And he knew just the guy, Mr. Adrian Belew, who at the time I think was in the Talking Heads. a band that I'm not too familiar with, to be honest. I know they're considered a new wave band, and again, I'm not really sure to this day what new wave really means, but basically a late 70s non-punk, non-heavy metal band. That's basically how I categorize it. And Fripp knew he had to have him. So he called up Adrian Belew, and they were talking. They'd already met before when he was in, I think while he was in Talking Heads, they had met at a concert or something. And Adrian Belew jumped on the idea, but at this point, he was actually a rising star, and he had a few solo record deals. So he said, you know what, I'll join on one condition, if I could still kind of develop my solo career in the meantime. And Fripp, he wanted him so bad, he totally agreed with that. And again, just like Bill Bruford, he ended up being one of the longtime King Crimson collaborators. He would sing on every King Crimson album, starting with this one onward, and just proved to be just a breath of fresh air in the band, and one of my all-time favorite members of King Crimson. Just an incredible guitar player, and also a pretty damn good singer as well. And I feel like I should give you guys a little bit of backstory on Adrian Belew, because I honestly think he's a genius and just so important to King Crimson's history. So Adrian Belew, and what can you say about this guy? I mean, right from day one, right from the early 70s when he was getting his start in the whole music scene, he was hell-bent on making a name for himself, having a very unique and distinctive guitar playing style. And, there have been many amazing, unique guitar players, Robert Fripp being one of them, that no one else sounds like him, but I really think no one else sounds like Adrian Belew. He was just so unique. He was a guitar synthesizer pioneer and really played in this extremely avant-garde experimental style, just incorporating all kinds of different effects into his guitar playing. And for him, it was always about like the atmosphere that the guitar can create, rather than the actual like melodies and the actual notes he's playing. It was more of the sound, the actual tone of the guitar. And he really made a name for himself, because Frank Zappa, of all people, one of the great innovators of 21st century music, actually discovered him. And he was actually invited to play for Frank Zappa. He was invited to audition, and the story goes that he totally fucked up the first audition, but begged Frank Zappa to let him have a second. And the second one was a little bit more one-on-one. I think they went to Zappa's house or something, and he played a few notes on his guitar, and Zappa immediately hired him. And really, when he played with Frank Zappa's band, that was kind of like a crash course on music theory. We all know that Frank Zappa was like this amazing composer, and he was really strict with his musicians. Like you really had to have the chops to be in Zappa's band. So in the late 70s, this is the late 70s we're talking about here, Adrian Belew really got his start in the Zappa band. It lasted about a year. I think he was on one of Zappa's albums. But soon after that, he ended up playing on David Bowie's album Lodger. Again, David Bowie being a huge Frank Zappa fan, he discovered him. And I found that interesting how Robert Fripp would actually play on Bowie's next album, Scary Monsters, after Adrian Belew already played on Lodger. So really, Adrian Belew was that big at the time that David Bowie thought of him over Robert Fripp, at least in terms of like chronological order. So I find that David Bowie connection hilarious. And then finally he would go on to be in the Talking Heads as kind of a second guitar player, across from David Byrne. I think he appeared on one of their albums, and again, it was pretty short-lived, so this guy was really living fast in the late 70s, and then, of course, Robert Fripp would discover him. He would join King Crimson, and he would also act as the lyricist and vocalist on the album as well, but his main role was definitely that incredibly enigmatic and unique guitar playing style, as kind of like a foil to Robert Fripp, which is fantastic. But his vocals and lyrics are great as well, as we'll talk about. So there we had it. We had 3/4 of the band already in place. Now they just needed a bass player. So funny enough, Bill Bruford, he actually recommended Jeff Berlin, who's an incredible bass player, if you guys haven't heard of him, who had played with Bill Bruford on his solo albums in the Bruford Band, which is just, I gotta plug this band in here. The Bruford Band is just a fucking amazing jazz fusion band. Everyone's got to hear this one. I definitely recommend listening to One of a Kind is the first album. And yeah, he was a really close companion, a close collaborator with Bruford. But Robert Fripp found that his bass playing style was a little bit too busy, and that's not what he was looking for. Again, Robert Fripp, he had all these ideas for what this band was going to be. And, although Jeff Berlin is a fantastic bass player, he needed someone that would kind of fit the whole atmosphere and the whole kind of thing of what they were trying to do with this album. So he rejected Jeff Berlin, and he held auditions. So he held a few auditions, wasn't really liking the bass players that were coming in. And then all of a sudden, Mr. Tony Levin walks in. And Fripp is just like, fuck me. Because, okay, Tony Levin, incredible bass player and Chapman stick player as well, as we'll get into. And he'd actually crossed paths with Fripp before. Again, he'd been Peter Gabriel's longtime bass player. I think still is to this day. And again, with Fripp playing on all those Peter Gabriel albums, they must have crossed paths at one point. And if he knew that Tony Levin was available, man, he wouldn't even have held auditions. He would have just took him into the band right away. But in walks Tony Levin, and it was a sealed deal. I mean, he played a few lines of Red, didn't even play the entire song, and Fripp was already like welcoming him with open arms as the bass player of the band, and again, the Chapman stick player. So the band was fully formed. And again, they weren't known as King Crimson at the time. They were known as Discipline, and Robert Fripp laid down the groundwork of what this band was going to be, what he envisioned them to sound like, and everything just definitely fit into place. They went on tour for a few months just to kind of hone their craft, really sort out the knots, no pun intended, in their overall sound. And throughout this early tour, they were still being billed as Discipline, and rather than King Crimson. And then somewhere down the road, the band came to this mutual agreement to just change the name to King Crimson, because they all agreed that at the end of the day, King Crimson was just a way of doing things, and the band had already been through so many lineup changes in the 70s that they thought that, they all agreed that, this really was King Crimson trying a new thing, and Robert Fripp definitely agreed with that. Plus, it also helped them sell a lot more albums because they already had a secure fan base rather than just venturing off and, starting from square one. So, there was some marketing involved as well. But anyway, regardless, the Crimson Kings were back. Then they hit the studio, recorded this fantastic album. It did pretty well. I think it went to number 30 or something on the UK charts. And didn't revolutionize like the music scene or anything, but for us prog fans, it totally did. And and they enjoyed another few years of relative stability for King Crimson with the exact same lineup. A really awesome lineup of King Crimson, and some absolutely funny stories happening during the recording of this album. The first one I want to tell you guys is about the song Thela Hun Ginjeet. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Where we hear Adrian Belew kind of talking about this frantic experience he had in the city being harassed by gangs and police officers. And I didn't actually know this until recently, but what you're actually hearing in that track is Adrian Belew actually describing an actual encounter he had when they were recording the album in England, and he was just walking around the city getting inspiration. He would walk around with his tape recorder, record things that he'd be hearing around to give him inspiration later on. And he ended up running into this fucking gang who almost smashed his tape recorder. Then the police ended up getting involved. It was this whole crazy scenario. So Adrian Belew went back to the studio, told him his crazy encounter, how he almost got killed. And Robert Fripp, ironically enough, was secretly tape recording him retelling that story. And what you're hearing is actually Adrian Belew retelling the story. Robert Fripp recorded it, put it onto the song, and the rest is history. I just find that so ironic, just so genius. And the second story I want to tell you guys is about Bill Bruford. At first, we all know that he got along very well with King Crimson. He was very grateful to be in the band, and to this day he has nothing but good things to say about King Crimson. But he would clash with Robert Fripp sometimes. Again, Bill Bruford, especially coming off of those jazz fusion albums he just did, his playing style is often very busy, which I love, but it did not suit the kind of music that Fripp had envisioned for the album. So it's kind of funny how Fripp still went to Bruford, because I really think he knew Bruford could adapt to anything, because he was such a versatile drummer. He just had to get a little bit of encouragement from Fripp to drop the jazzy kind of busy drumming and develop a new style, which at first kind of annoyed Bill Bruford, but he's such a great guy. He totally did that, and he even incorporated a lot of the electric drums on this album, which again was a very early 80s kind of thing. And for the most part, I'm not a huge fan of electric drums, but it's fucking Bill Bruford, and he made it work. And he played all kinds of different percussion on this album. He even did some world music stuff with the wooden blocks and things like that. And just totally reinvented his whole drumming style for this. Got rid of all the cymbals. There's barely any cymbal clashes on the entire album, which is absolutely crazy. So again, that's an awesome story from the album, how Bill Bruford just really adapted to the sound and the vision that Fripp had for the album. So again, such an adaptable musician. So guys, that's the history of the band. Again, very interesting how they got all these kind of eclectic members together, and how it all sprung from ideas that were envisioned by Robert Fripp in the late 70s. So now, without further ado, let's talk about the overall review of this thing so I can really get in depth of what the unique sound that I keep talking about actually is and why it's just so fantastic on this album. Okay, guys, so enough beating around the bush. Let's dive right into Discipline, because this album here is just one of a kind, guys. I mean, I dare you to find any other album that sounds anything like this. It's almost as if King Crimson here created their own genre of music, because you can't really classify it. And it's funny, if you go on Wikipedia and look at the genre description of this album, it literally has like 10 genres, but really it doesn't belong to any of those. It's a unique thing that Robert Fripp just envisioned, and he had the perfect musicians at the right time to make that genius idea come into fruition. And as I describe the music of this album, I just want you guys to keep two things on the back of your mind: the name of the album itself and the original name of the band, Discipline, and the album artwork itself. Now, on first look, this album cover might not be very striking. I mean, you look at it, it's this really cool interweaving Celtic knot on the cover, encased in this sea of red. And, at first, it seems like pretty abstract and pretty, it's aesthetically pleasing. It's really cool to see all the knot work and the intricate kind of interweaving lines. But it doesn't really scream awesome album cover. But once you hear the music on this album, you guys will definitely see why this album cover is absolutely genius. It's the perfect artistic visual representation of the music on this album, as well as the title of the album. One of the most perfect unisons right there. So the first thing we got to talk about is the guitar playing on this album, guys. This album, I consider this a guitar god album. This is a textbook album to look at if you want to hear some of the most interesting and greatest guitar playing of all time. Robert Fripp and Adrian Belew are literally two of the greatest combinations in rock history. Again, they have totally different styles, but when they come together, it creates something special, it creates something unique, and something that shouldn't work. Okay, it's just insane how this falls into place. So first, let's talk about the main theme on this album: the interlocking guitars. There's a lot of points throughout the album, especially on the last track, Discipline, where we get Robert Fripp and Adrian Belew playing these interlocking guitar melodies at the same time. So they're both playing these different guitar sections, but they're kind of out of step by a bit, so it feels in sync and out of sync at the same time. And it creates this amazing effect. And I've never heard anything like this before in my life. It just sounds so cool. It's so technical, it's so hypnotic, and it's just a really cool rhythmic quality. And the reason I've never heard this before is because it was actually inspired by Indonesian classical music, also known as gamelan or gamelian. And Robert Fripp really took inspiration from that and wanted to incorporate that into his own unique brand of progressive rock music, which totally explains why we haven't heard it before. And honestly, it's just so hard to describe, but it just sounds so otherworldly. Like these two guitars coming together, creating this like almost mechanical, perfectly interlocking melody, and it's just extremely hypnotic. I love that effect, and it's really kind of the main theme running throughout the album. Now, not every track on the album uses that effect, but when it does, it's like, damn, that is it's such a cool sound. So we talked about the unison between Fripp and Belew, but what about their different styles? Now, during a lot of tracks on this album, we hear Adrian Belew's distinct, creative, highly unusual guitar playing style. This guy, he uses the whammy bar to the max, and he uses all kinds of different effects on his guitar, all kinds of different guitar synths and effects, creating this kind of mechanical, almost industrial sounding riffing at some points, but at other points he uses these crazy synths to create these weird sounds on his guitar, like almost sounding like animals at one point, and that's really used to its fullest extent on the first track, Elephant Talk, where he makes his guitar sound like an elephant. Absolutely insane. So you got this guy going, and at the same time, we often have Robert Fripp playing these incredibly complex, fast-paced arpeggios, which is basically this really, oh my god, this really like fast-picking extravaganza, and it's so frantic, it's so repetitive, and again, just like the interlocking guitar harmonies, it's hypnotic as well. And you often have that going at the same time as Adrian Belew's highly distinctive industrial sounding riffs or crazy synthesized guitar parts. And it shouldn't work, but it totally does. So again, this album here is just a masterclass in eccentric guitar playing, and it works absolutely perfectly. Now, again, these styles aren't on every single song, but a good 3 or 4 out of the 8 tracks on the album, or 7 tracks, can't remember how many it has now, incorporate these disparate styles, and it just works so perfectly. So the guitar playing here, probably the best in King Crimson's entire discography up to this point. And I know you're gonna say, like, fuck, it doesn't have the heavy edge of Red or Lark's Tongues in Aspic or anything like that, or the really haunting melodic sounds in the Court of the Crimson King, but I think it totally makes up for it. And Robert Fripp does some interesting stuff on the guitar too. He puts his guitar through some synthesizer too, especially on the Sheltering Sky, kind of like the big instrumental on the album, and throughout other sections as well. So it's not really always Adrian Belew having all the fun with the guitar effects. Robert Fripp does it as well. And overall, I think for me, Robert Fripp steals the show. As flashy and amazing as Adrian Belew is, what I really focus on when I listen to this album is Robert Fripp's incredibly fast-paced picking style on this album, which is just, man, the guy was a freaking virtuoso, one of the greatest technical guitar players of all time. Now, if 2 of the greatest guitar performances of all time weren't enough for you guys, we also get Tony Levin on the Chapman stick. And he is, oh man, guys, Tony Levin is just so fantastic on this album. And if you guys are new to King Crimson, I bet you're wondering what the fuck a Chapman stick is. Well, basically, I was in the same boat. From the first time I saw that Elephant Talk video, honestly, I had no idea what this guy was playing. It looked like a freaking fretboard with strings, and he was tapping it, and I'm like, what is this? Is it a bass? Is it some kind of weird, like, 8-string guitar? But no, it's kind of it's its own thing. It was an instrument kind of invented in the early 70s, and it is kind of like a bass. It acts as a bass, but you play it as if, almost like a keyboard, like you tap the strings against the board, and it gives it a more complex sound. You could do a lot more with it than a usual bass. And masters of this instrument, like Tony Levin, was an early pioneer of this thing. They would be playing the bass chords and the melodic lines at the same point. So really, think of it as like a bass that could do so much more. And honestly, Tony Levin's mastery of this instrument is just one of those things on the album that gives it its unique flair. I mean, nothing else sounds like this. And you often have Tony Levin really driving a lot of these tracks with his funky Chapman stick playing, and giving the song like that kind of awesome, funky backdrop for Adrian Belew and Robert Fripp to really play over, and it's just awesome. I mean, there's so many things just happening at the same time that just all fit into place. On one hand, you got Tony Levin playing these groovy lines on his Chapman stick, even really taking center stage at some points. Like on Elephant Talk, that whole track is really based on his Chapman stick playing. And then you got Adrian Belew doing his thing, and Robert Fripp as well. And they're all playing in different time signatures, playing different tempos and everything. And it shouldn't work together. It's polyrhythmic by definition, but it works so well. And it really, again, just like when Robert Fripp and Adrian Belew work together, and their 2 totally different styles converge when they get into that interlocking guitar playing, so does the music in general. I mean, even when they're playing different things at the same time, everything just seems to lock into place into this really hypnotic, again, I keep using that word, this hypnotic, mechanical kind of feel. And when I use the word mechanical, I mean that in the sense of, these different lines, these different parts of the tracks are repeating over and over again. Kind of like wheels in a machine, like a machine that keeps churning and churning and churning, but in a good way. And I really think that's where the title of the album came from, with Discipline. This album here, it's focused on creating rhythms rather than going off and wandering off into uncharted territory and improvs and solos and time changes. The album itself is just really focused on the actual rhythm and the interlocking and interweaving of all the instruments. So now hopefully that's all coming into place now with the title of the album and the cover with the interweaving Celtic knot. It's perfect. And I love that. And it's just such a contrast to the earlier King Crimson stuff that was just really loose and would wander off into different subsections and everything. This is virtuosic, but it doesn't wander off into lengthy solos or anything like that. It's really about how everything gels together. And I really think that in its essence, that's what the band meant by calling themselves Discipline. Like, this was a disciplined version of King Crimson. Now, this album, I mentioned there's some variation on the album. That rule doesn't apply to every single song. There's a pretty nice free form kind of track. It's 8 minutes long. It's an instrumental on the album, and this one here incorporates a lot of the world music influence that, again, with the interlocking guitars being taken from that Indonesian music. It's not really obvious, but with this track here, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obviously inspired by African tribal music, which is awesome. And even some Middle Eastern sounding effects come in there. And that's a little bit of a looser structure, but it still has that kind of core rhythm that's driving throughout. So that's one of the exceptions. Another one is Mate Kudasai, which is just a beautiful ballad. Doesn't really fit in with the overall theme of the album, but it's absolutely awesome. And finally, the absolutely heavy track Indiscipline, which the total opposite of this album, because of course we have the song Discipline, and this one here is the polar opposite. This one here is a disorganized song, and it was really just Fripp's way of giving Bill Bruford time to really expand and do all these crazy things on the drums, whereas before, with most of the tracks, he was really confined to locking into the intricate rhythms that Tony Levin, Adrian Belew, and Robert Fripp were creating. So this was kind of like just throwing Bill Bruford a bone, saying like, okay, let's improvise. And it's also a really heavy, menacing song on the album, which is an element they took from the earlier years of King Crimson. Again, the rest of this album isn't menacing at all. Sure, you get some bits of darkness here or there, but overall, I wouldn't really consider this a heavy album. So yeah, so with those 3 songs, you get exceptions to the general overall sound of the album. And that's nice because they're kind of scattered throughout, and it prevents listeners' fatigue because all those interlocking melodies and rhythms can wear on you after a while. But the band knew better, and they put these totally different tracks in between to kind of break up the action and keep the listening experience fresh, which is absolutely awesome. And a lot of these tracks end up being the highlights, believe it or not. So go figure. So awesome. So I guess we got to talk about a few more things before we get into the track-by-track review. Like, for example, the singing style. So we got Adrian Belew singing on this album, and although he was primarily a guitar player, primarily brought in for his unique guitar playing style, his vocals are pretty awesome as well. People compare him to David Byrne of Talking Heads, and maybe that's where he got his singing style from. But it's pretty crazy. I mean, at some points, you get him singing these really melodic, sorrowful lines with long, extended notes, almost sounding like a crooner from the 50s with that low-register voice, like on songs like Mate Kudasai and Frame by Frame and things like that. But on the other hand, he sounds absolutely manic on some tracks. Actually, most of them. Where it's either spoken word, he's telling like some crazy story, or he's shouting, screaming. He just sounds absolutely like a madman set loose on this album, which is absolutely awesome and gives it this really quirky vibe. And same thing with the lyrics, just very quirky, very out there, and funny at points as well. So I really like Adrian Belew's vocal performance on this album, so really good stuff there. And I already mentioned Bill Bruford's playing before, really gelling with the rest of the band here, not wandering off into that crazy rhythmic jazzy stuff. He really just locks into the rhythm with the band, which might have been a little bit restrictive to him at first, but again, they give him Indiscipline to really shine, and also Sheltering Sky, where he's playing all these like world music instruments like wooden blocks and things like that, and the electric drums as well. So that was a big difference. So yeah, guys, that's pretty much the gist of this album. It's, as you can tell, it's an extremely unique album with all kinds of different elements, and even within its uniqueness, given like the overall structure of the album, there's a lot of like weird songs that at first don't really sound like they belong on the album, peppered throughout. So again, just so much variation, so much originality, and some people say there's like an element of new wave in this album, and I can't really comment on that because I don't really know the new wave genre, but as far as I know, it's really a meaningless word that, again, describes non-punk music of the late 70s, but yet it was inspired by punk. So I don't really understand that shit. But yeah. And another funny thing is, a lot of people say that Adrian Belew brought in this kind of like pop influence onto the album. I don't see that at all. I don't think this album is very poppy, very accessible. It doesn't really have a lot of catchy choruses or things like that. It's pretty experimental, pretty avant-garde, I would say. So I don't know what people are saying by that, but anyway, guys, let's talk about the track-by-track reviews. Opening up the album, we get the iconic Elephant Talk. Again, the song that really got me into King Crimson after that long hiatus, the song that really made me check out the band's discography. So this is a really special song to me, and it's just an awesome track. This one here is really driven by Tony Levin's fantastic Chapman stick playing. that main line that he plays throughout the entire song is just so funky, so memorable, and so melodic. You gotta love it. It's just, oh man, it really is some of the best bass playing I've ever heard in my life, or Chapman stick style bass playing. It's awesome. It's like playing a game of guess the instrument. Like, you really don't know what instrument this guy's playing until you actually like research it. Because again, it has the bass, right? But it also has this melodic edge that you don't really hear much from the bass unless you're playing like Jaco Pastorius or something. But absolutely fantastic. He kind of really makes the song and takes center stage here. But the guitar playing is absolutely incredible on this song as well. And before you know it, Fripp comes in with his incredibly intricate and complex picking style that kind of runs through the whole track. And then before you know it, Adrian Belew comes in with these sharp guitar lines that just kind of cut through the mix, giving it this really metallic edge. Really cool stuff going on there. We don't really get any interlocking guitar harmonies between Fripp and Belew on this track, but it pretty much has all the other elements that run through the album. And before you know it, Adrian Belew comes in with his eccentric vocal delivery. This is one of the more manic songs on the album. He's basically just shouting the entire thing, and the whole track is kind of like this abstract piece where Belew is just basically dishing out all these synonyms for the word talk, like things like diatribe, chit-chat, bicker, and he puts a lot of attitude into his vocal delivery on this track, so really, really funny performance. Again, the vocals might be a little bit distracting from the music on this song, but they're just so playful and so eccentric that you gotta love it. You gotta love this guy's performance. So he isn't really singing, but he's just shouting like a madman, and it might take a little bit of getting used to, but I love it. And then breaking up the verses, we get this really uplifting kind of happy riff by Robert Fripp, and it's hilarious because if you watch the live performance I was talking about earlier, they zoom in on Fripp and he just smiles. He just has this wide grin on his face, which is hilarious because the guy would never smile. And I have a funny feeling they were telling him like smile a little more, and he was just doing it to be a smart ass. But it's just a really funny sight, really uplifting riff. And then during this section, we get the famous Adrian Belew guitar effects, making it sound like an elephant just screaming full force. Incredible. Just such a unique guitar playing style there. And the whole band is gelling so well, and Tony Levin's incredible Chapman stick line is just churning throughout the entire song. Really awesome. Later on in the track, there's two incredible guitar solos. The first by Adrian Belew, which is, again, very interesting. Pretty much all his guitar parts are genius on this song, where the whole song kind of just winds down, and we get this tribal Saharan African kind of feel with the drumming and the gentle strumming in the background. And then Adrian Belew comes in with that solo, which is just extremely high pitched and like almost like a whistling kind of effect on the guitar. So that's really unique. And then the second solo is just one of Robert Fripp's classic atonal solos, again fed through the synthesizer, giving it that very strange, almost industrial effect to it. So really cool stuff. Fucking amazing song. Honestly, I would give this one easily a 9 out of 10. Some days I feel a 9.5. The only thing keeping it back from me giving it like a higher score is just the vocals, which can be a bit distracting. But overall, musically, it's just such a fantastic song. The next track on the album here, guys, Frame by Frame, is absolutely phenomenal. My favorite song on the album, one of my all-time favorite King Crimson songs, and just an absolute fucking masterclass, an absolute masterpiece in guitar playing. This is just absolutely insane. I mean, right off the bat, we get some of the most frantic, insane, technically proficient Robert Fripp, frantic picking of all time. I mean, his picking on this song is absolutely crazy. And it's unbelievable how he can maintain that for so long. I mean, that goes for a straight minute and a half, and it seems to build and build and get even more and more intense as he goes along, even more fast-paced. And over that, we get Adrian Belew's awesome, again, sharp, metallic style riffing going on there. And his riff is pretty awesome as well. So you get this more simplistic Adrian Belew riff going over the crazy thing that Robert Fripp is doing. And again, it sucks you in. It's just so hypnotic. And then after 1 minute of that absolute pandemonium, we get the beautiful interlocking guitars between them. And it's just, man, you're on cloud 9 when this section comes in. And they're just locking in so perfectly, just like those interweaving knots on the album cover. It's It's just so good, guys. And then when it gets into the vocals, the interlocking guitar melodies continue, and Adrian Belew is just singing incredibly melodic, kind of long extended notes, giving it this mournful, melancholic kind of feel that I really love. And there's some great vocal harmonies in the back too, so I really enjoy the vocals on this song. Just absolutely beautiful. And one thing I gotta mention about this track, the structure of the song is extremely tight and, dare I say, disciplined, because really it just alternates between those three sections. The crazy, frantic picking section by Robert Fripp with the sparse riffing on top by Belew, and then we get into the interlocking guitar section, and then finally the vocal melody. And it kind of just repeats that kind of pattern a few times, but the song ends off on a more extended version of the interlocking melody where it just builds in intensity, and then even at the end we get Robert Fripp coming in again with some of that frantic riffing going over the interlocking guitar melodies. So really just so much fucking going on in this track. It's absolutely beautiful, and one of my all-time favorite Crimson songs. This one here easily gets a 9.5 out of 10, and again, some days I feel like it's a 10 out of 10, but right now we'll stick with a 9.5. Track number 3, Mate Kudasai, which I think means she waits in Japanese or something like that. This is a really cool track. I consider it the ballad on the album. Again, breaking up the action of the more standard, disciplined sounding kind of tracks on the album here. And it's absolutely beautiful. Adrian Belew really steals the show here with his fantastic slide guitar playing, which is absolutely haunting and melodic, and perfectly fits in with his amazing vocals. Again, like frame by frame, really crooning and extending his lines, giving it that melancholic feel. And Robert Fripp in the background as well. He's doing a great job, just holding it down with these nice bluesy kind of tremolo lines on his guitar, along with Tony Levin giving the song like that nice laid back kind of foundation, which is really unique for Robert Fripp's playing. Usually he doesn't really play the guitar like that, but really interesting stuff. So yeah, beautiful song, that nice palate cleanser to break up the action on the album. And I would definitely give this one a 9 out of 10. So closing out side one of the album, we get an absolute fan favorite, Indiscipline. And this track here was the one that the band would continue to play long after the release of this album, often drastically changing the arrangement. And it's always been a fan favorite. This track here is just, again, with the title Indiscipline, it was intentionally going against the grain, going against the general theme of this album. And again, it's very different from all the tracks that came before it and all the tracks that would come after it. This one here is just a nightmarish, heavy, experimental, avant-garde song that I absolutely love. And really, this song here is what is the track on the album that really draws the most from King Crimson's past, specifically that trilogy of albums starting with Lark's Tongues and Aspic, with the really dark, sinister sounding music. Very heavy, again, almost like heavy metal at points, but again, very avant-garde and very sinister sounding. And it's just an incredible song. And as I mentioned earlier on, this song was really the loosest on the album, the most jammy, improvisational. It still has a pretty strict structure going on to it, but like it has these loose kind of jam sessions where Bill Bruford is just going nuts on the drums. An absolutely stellar drumming performance by Bill Bruford. And normally they would actually open up this track with like a Bill Bruford drum solo. So this is really Bill's time to shine, really time to stretch out of the tight rhythmic constraints of the rest of the album. And yeah, it's really awesome. It basically starts off with this ominous bass line that just plods along with Bill doing all this kind of sparse, rapid fire drumming in the background. But then before you know it, we get into this absolutely nightmarish, hellish riff, the down 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 down, like something straight out of Lark's Tongues and Aspic, straight out of Red. And then on top of that, I think it's Adrian Belew playing these dissonant guitar lines over that. And again, it just creates this crazy polyrhythmic thing. Bill Bruford's just going nuts on the drums. Then the song suddenly stops and we get a spoken word vocal section by Adrian Belew, and it sounds really, really nightmarish, and he sounds extremely, he sounds extremely weird on this part of the track, talking about this abstract object that he looks at and then, doesn't look at for a few days, and he's talking about how it remains consistent, and all this weird artsy-fartsy kind of shit going on. Apparently it was inspired by a letter his wife wrote him about a sculpture she made or something like that. But it creates this really weird abstract effect. And in the background, you get some like sweet picking by by Robert Fripp, just heightening the intensity during some of these spoken word sections before diving right back into the experimental, loose kind of jam sessions that really sound like they come straight from hell. Such an awesome track. I love when Adrian Belew repeats the line, I repeat myself when under stress. I repeat myself when under stress. I repeat myself. It's just freaking hilarious. And great, great part of the song there that you don't really expect. So I love the whole kind of stop and start nature of this track, the heaviness of it, and Adrian Belew's nightmarish spoken word vocals that are absolutely eccentric. So fantastic track. And again, I just love how they would just switch up the arrangement on this track every single time. When I saw them live last year in 2019, it literally took me a good 3 minutes to realize the track was even Indiscipline because it sounded completely different. But the album version's fantastic as well. I gotta say, I do really prefer the live versions to the album version of this track, just like a lot of other King Crimson songs, to be honest. So the album version I would give a 9 out of 10, but some of the live versions I heard might even be a 9.5 out of 10. So fantastic track. The next track, guys, Thela Hun Ginjeet, opening up side 2 of the album. This is probably my second favorite track. I absolutely love this song. It's so unique, so creative, and so weird. Only a band like King Crimson could come up with something like this. But most of all, it fucking grooves. I mean, the bass playing, or the Chapman stick playing by Tony Levin on this track is just fucking phenomenal. It's just so funky. It just pulsates throughout the entire song, and you just can't help but bop your head the entire time. But really, all the other elements are here. The song opens up with Robert Fripp's frantic picking style, and then Adrian Belew's sharp metallic riffs playing over that, just like a lot of the earlier songs on the album. And it's absolutely fantastic. It has this world music kind of feel with Bill Bruford's kind of tin pan sounding drums, and then especially when the whole band comes in with those vocal harmonies where they're just singing Thela Hun Ginjeet, Thela Hun Ginjeet. It gives it this very, African tribal kind of feel to it. And then we got Adrian Belew coming in with his trademark, long extended vocal lines that are pretty cool. And again, I think the title is an anagram for Heat in the Jungle. He uses the word heat in the jungle a lot throughout the song, and I guess they did that to give the song more of a world music kind of feel. With the title being all rearranged into some gibberish, foreign sounding language kind of thing. But anyway, it's not really important because really the main attraction of this track is Adrian Belew's account of when he was wandering through New York or London, I forget the city, with his tape recorder, and he ran into that gang and the police officers, as I told you guys earlier on in the review, and Robert Fripp was secretly recording Adrian Belew recounting this event, and that acts as the main kind of meat and potatoes, the main midsection of the track. And so we just hear Adrian Belew just recounting this series of events. With Tony Levin, he switches up his bass line from this funky groove to more of this doomy sounding kind of thing. And it's fantastic. I mean, it shouldn't work, but it absolutely does. And it goes on for about 3-4 minutes in length. And I feel like they could have extended that another 5 minutes and it still would have been fantastic. And you also gotta love the guitar effects going on throughout this entire midsection. They're just so sharp and almost creepy sounding, giving the whole thing this kind of sinister vibe to it. And again, with Tony Levin's kind of doomy bass line in the background, it's just the perfect atmosphere. And then, of course, you got Adrian Belew telling his story. And it's actually pretty funny. At one point, he's talking about, the gang approaching him and being totally confused about why he has this tape recorder. And he actually goes on to explain, look, guys, I'm in this band. Look, he takes his jacket off, shows him the tape recorder. Oh, that reminds me, it's getting hot down here. And yeah, so, they end up letting him go, and it's just so funny how he says it in the story. He's like, yeah, at the end of the day, they just ended up letting me go. I don't really know why. Just love how he just casually says that after this harrowing story. And then how he ends up running into actual police officers, which is hilarious because, again, I think the gang thought that he was an undercover cop with his tape recorder. And then who does he end up walking into but 2 cops? It's just a really interesting, really funny story. And the amazing thing is it doesn't detract from the music. Usually when there's spoken word and things like that, it kind of distracts you from the actual music. But everything, again, just locks perfectly into place. The song ends with some awesome synthesized guitar solos. I think the first one by Belew and the second one by Fripp. And it dives into that original funky bass groove. The do-do-do-do-do, again, you can't help but just bang your head to that shit. Incredible song. Just works on every single level. I would easily give this one a 9.5 out of 10. Coming up next on the album, we get an almost 9-minute instrumental, The Sheltering Sky. And I absolutely love The Sheltering Sky. I feel like I was underrating this song for a long time. It never really stood out as one of the highlights on the album, but after years of listening to this, it's really revealed itself to me. And it's just a beautiful song. Again, unlike anything else on the album, this is kind of like King Crimson going back to their earlier philosophy of just doing a band improv and just letting the song speak with a lot of atmosphere rather than having a tight structure like most of the other tracks on the album. But this one here is just beautiful, and it never feels overlong, although it's 8 or 9 minutes in length, and it kind of does repeat the same kind of themes and melodies a lot throughout the track. It's just really one of those tracks tonight to just zone out to and just enjoy the beauty of it. And it has a lot of those world music influences. We got Bill Bruford playing the wooden blocks, and the whole song just kind of has this African tribal drumming kind of vibe with Bill Bruford and Tony Levin's backdrop there, but also a lot of Middle Eastern sounding things. Robert Fripp comes in with this absolutely crazy sounding Middle Eastern, almost like, I don't know the name of the instrument, but it almost kind of sounds like a wind instrument, like kind of the flute that a snake charmer would play. Kind of sounds like that. And it's absolutely beautiful and atonal, and it just evokes all these images of the Middle East. And it's just great. And then after this part here, we get into this nice, laid-back, interlocking guitar section. So again, you have the two guitars playing those two melodies interlocking, but it's much more laid back and less intense than on most of the other tracks of the album. And Tony Levin's bass work here during this middle section of the track is really the standout for me. His bass playing is just so deep, so melodic, and just so evocative. I absolutely love it. Then later on, we get some more sparse guitar synth parts coming in again from Robert Fripp, and then it kind of like all comes together right back into that original snake charmer sounding section before ending off the track. And I just love the gentle strumming that kind of runs through this part. The ding 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 ding. Just such an awesome track. Beautiful, beautiful song. I think one of King Crimson's best instrumentals. Just totally different from all the other instrumentals they've done. Much more relaxing, laid back, and world music inspired. Everyone does a fantastic job here. And for that reason alone, I'm going to give this one a 9, maybe even a 9.5 out of 10. Just incredible song. Alright guys, so closing out the album, we get another instrumental. The title track of the whole thing, Discipline. And let me tell you guys, if you love the interlocking guitars that were featured on this album, you're going to absolutely love this song. Because that's basically what it is. It's just 4.5 to 5 minutes of interlocking guitar masterclass. And if that's your thing, if that was your favorite thing on the album, you're going to absolutely love this song. Now, personally, for me, I love that technique, but it was everything else on the album that came together, plus that technique, that makes me love this album. On this track here, it's just really meant to be a showcase for Adrian Belew and Robert Fripp's interlocking guitars. And for me, it's probably the most stagnant song on the album, the most rhythmically tight and confined track on the album, not leaving any room for any sections to breathe and expand and for variations to come in. So again, it's just, for me, my least favorite song on the album. I still like it, but if I had to pick a least favorite track on the album, this would be it. And ironically enough, I really think Tony Levin and Bill Bruford's bass playing and drumming on this track really make the song. I mean, it's just absolutely pulsating throughout the whole thing, giving it like that human quality, because again, those interlocking guitars could sound really mechanical and really inhuman at points. So props to Bill Bruford and Tony Levin for putting that human element into it. But overall, it's not enough to really save the song from the repetitiveness. And again, I'm no musician, so maybe this song is more fun to play and to analyze than to actually listen to. But that's just my opinion. And sorry to come across as negative, because I actually do enjoy the song. But just compared to the other ones, it has the least personality to it. So I would give Discipline a solid 8 to 8.5 out of 10. Great track, just not one of my absolute favorites. And that brings us to the end of the album. Just what a masterpiece. Such a unique album here. I love the guitar playing. I love the techniques. And it's just one of my all-time favorite King Crimson albums. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay tuned. I'm going to be bringing you guys a whole lot more reviews. Hopefully a lot of King Crimson reviews in the future. Because such an exciting band to talk about. And I'd love to bring you guys more. So thanks again, and peace out.